Mani, and this is Fulbright Women Podcast Season 2. We're excited to bring to you 20 brilliant women who are pushing the boundaries in their fields and lives and serving as inspirations to so many around them. Joining us today is Komal Dilshad. Komal went to Syracuse University for a master's in advertising. And after working in advertisements for some time, she found herself pivoting in the development sector. Today, we're talking about this shift of career, her projects, and the challenges she faces to materialize her goals. Hi, Komal.
Hi, Safia. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
No, of course. Thank you so much for taking out time to do this with me today. Komal, let's just start with, because what's really fascinating in your case is there's a pivot, a shift in the career, right? What led to this shift?
Right. So, as you have already seen, I started off my career in advertising, and then advertising is sort of a hardcore, cutthroat, adrenaline rush, deadlines kind of a thing. And while I was doing advertising, and I was also looking after a lot of brands, some of them national, some of them international, I was also constantly thinking about the fact that at the end of the day, is there really any change that happens in a person's life because of all of the branding and advertising that we're doing? So this sort of led me to explore more a communications development or a development communications sort of a niche, wherein now that I'm working with USIP, which is the US Institute of Peace, they were one of our clients actually. So they were at that point in time doing an awareness campaign around reforms in the rule of law sector. And that's sort of what got me interested. And that's why and how I made the pivot, just because I wanted at that particular time to see if the work actually had an impact on a common person's life. I think if your work impacts even one person and changes their life, that's perhaps more important. And that's something that unfortunately at that point in time, whatever brands I was working on, I couldn't see it there.
Very interesting, because impact is what a lot of people actually talk about, right? To get that kind of gratification within that your work matters, right? And we can get it in different ways. For you, it was in the public sector, like you said. Help me understand your experience in the public sector so far.
So I think the public sector is, I'm sort of working at a niche of where the development sector kind of collides with the public sector. And I think while I've seen development sector have impact, but we've seen this happen throughout. We've even seen this happen in Afghanistan as well, where we've seen that, the work that development sector actually does, do we really see it translate into results or not? I think we'll see it translate into results, but it's definitely a game of more than a decade. Everything that the development sector does in Pakistan is perhaps going to have an impact 10 or 15 years down the road, because you're essentially looking at behavior change. But I find the niche of public sector much more interesting, because that's where the real change happens. Because if you're able to reform a system, or if you're able to bring change within the public sector, then that would lead to change in the coming years. And over there, again, as compared to a behavioral change within a society, you're sort of looking at behavioral change within an organization, which is slightly more measurable and slightly more achievable. And then that would perhaps, as a next step, lead to change within a society. So I would say that's why the intersection of development sector and public sector. And sadly, in Pakistan, I also think there's two things. Our public sector definitely needs improvement. I think there's no two sides of the story about that. There are no qualms in saying that. I think the second fact is also this, that while we have a lot of talent within the country, or people like yourself who are studying abroad and then coming back, the public sector sadly really does not have the tools to engage those experts, because our rules are sort of set back in the colonial era. We really do not have space to do that. So when you sort of work at this intersection of development and public sector, it really allows you to sort of hone in the expertise and bring the experts and allow them to work. So I would say perhaps that's why the public sector.
Very interesting. So if I have to ask Komal, what are some of the behavioral changes that you are targeting at, that you are interested in to be able and aspiring to create that kind of change?
Sure. So one of the key things that I'm passionately working on, and my team is working on with me, is women inclusion. So we are currently working on having more women, getting more women recruited within the police force. Now, to sort of give you a background, most of the provinces have either a 10% quota for women or a 15%. Sadly, we have perhaps less than 2% women in all of the provinces within the police force. Now this also ties to all of your issues which are related to gender-based violence, which are related to rape, which are related to honor killings, etc. as well. So I would say that this is one of the key changes that we are trying to work on, just because again I think the idea is that we really cannot change behaviors if we start working within silos. So perhaps having separate centers for women or having separate police stations for women. We've done that as a society. We've tried that. It really hasn't worked out. So I really don't think you can create tolerance amongst men until unless you force them to work with women side by side. So I think within the rule of law at least when you complain that, I went in and I complained and the inspector or the sub-inspector was dismissive or was rude. Well, that's because he's never really worked with a woman. He operates in a man's world. So perhaps the best way to do that is make him work alongside a woman rather than just having ad hoc trainings. So yeah, women inclusion and mainstreaming, I would say these are the two things that I am currently working on.
Women in the law enforcement agencies, police, for example, here in this case, we all know that there are cultural and traditional barriers, when it comes to including women in, let's say, police force. But as someone who's been working particularly on this issue, I kind of want you to expand on these barriers.
So I would say that the first and immediate barrier is the lack of affirmative action. Because I think in order to sort of, satisfy the international community, satisfy the masses, satisfy all sorts of movement, etc., the government or the provincial governments have mandated a quota. But what is missing is the fact that there is absolutely zero effort to get those women recruited in. And even when, as an independent organization or as an individual or as a group of individuals, when effort is even being made to get those women to cross the barrier, there is absolute lack of affirmative action. And this lack of affirmative action stems from the general fact that women wouldn't even know that a drive has been announced. Whereas if a recruitment drive is announced in a province, every single man would know about it. I think first is this. I think the second fact is this, that a lot of the time when we interact with law enforcement, and particularly when we interact with the officers of the law enforcement circle who are responsible for all of these recruitments, etc., a lot of the times you would hear them say that, yes, we do get women, but they don't want to do field work, they want to just sit behind desks, etc. My take on that is that if in an organization where, let's assume, there are thousands of men and you only have 3 or 4 women, obviously they're going to shy away, they're going to be disadvantaged, and they would want to move together. Versus if you're able to get 100 or 200 women in together at the same time, you now have a camaraderie, and those women can help each other and sort of help them cross those barriers. So I would say, Safia, going back to it, lack of affirmative action, just having a policy is not going to help us. There needs to be affirmative action, there needs to be an implementation plan, and there needs to be clear target setting. If the quota is 2%, if there is 2% women today, you have to make sure that you have a target in the coming years that, all right, by 2025, what do you want to achieve? I would say that in some cases, we're even seeing the numbers dwindling. So again, affirmative action is what is definitely required for us to achieve the bare minimal of 10%. 10% is not the gold standard. Yeah, it's the bare minimal that needs to be achieved. And this translates actually across all the chains of public sector, and particularly the rule of law sector. Even if you look at lawyers, even if you look at judges, even if you look at the prosecution departments, home departments, everywhere, you would see that there is minimal to zero representation of women. They don't even get a seat on the decision-making table. So give them a seat and affirmative action. I will stop there.
there's so much to unpack there, right? But I kind of want to start from the first thing I heard in all of this, which is during the recruitment drive, the message is not delivered to the women. That is one of the first things you said, right? How can the message be delivered to women? How can we make sure that is implemented? Do you have some strategies, advice, ideas?
So I would say that perhaps the key strategy that can be deployed is the fact that that everywhere when you announce a recruitment drive, it's again one government department speaking to the other one and sort of sharing between institutions. You always have a minimum standard set that these women have to have 14 years of education or 16 years of education in a particular case, or at least have done 12th grade, right? Which means that all of them are enrolled in a formal education system. So perhaps the easiest way to do this is ask schools and colleges to actually make announcements and share information material there. Because again, because thousands of men are going to apply, they're going to hear from their peers that this is happening. Only a few women have ever applied, and unfortunately, due to the social cultural barriers, very few women do apply. They're not going to hear about this. I would say that's the first thing. And then again, the second thing is perhaps, and that's the more difficult task or the taller order, is trying to change behavioral attitudes. We cannot go back and say that women don't join the profession when the profession really does not do them any favors. You first have to make the organizational culture welcoming for them and then ask men to send the women of their households, because I and you might want to deny it, but the reality is that agency lies with men in the cases of lives of most of the women in Pakistan. So educating those men to send their women and education institutions, I would say, are two key things which can't be ignored in any strategy in convincing them to apply or informing them.
We will definitely get into the organizational culture and how it creates barriers for women who eventually do manage to join the police force. But I kind of still want to talk a little bit more about the solution that you presented, that more schools and more colleges that have students, women students, should be approached to deliver this message to whoever is interested in joining the forces. But then before delivering the message, we're saying something in the very sentence: whoever is interested in joining the forces, right? There is such an image of police forces, right? The prestige that is associated with the institution, there is the corruption that happens there. We all know that how it's you just said it, not just in our society, the police force itself is male dominated, right? So anywhere we hear in our culture, as it is, generally people are not interested in joining the police force, let alone the women, right? So I want you to talk about that, and keep in mind that women in our cultures are not even socialized to be physically violent, that per se. They are not looking forward to being on the streets. Firstly, they're not trained, they're not told that they can be on streets, right? There's so many movements that women try to reclaim the streets, let's just say that. But let's also acknowledge that this field of being in the police force requires some kind of it can have some kind of violence involved in it, right? And so women are not trained or socialized to even think in that direction. How do we change that mindset first?
So I would say that the initial question, wherein of course it's a field where you're going to come face to face with at least some sort of violence, or at least you're going to come face to face with the victims of violence. That's the very least that's going to happen. I would say that in that, again, the first thing is institutions taking ownership themselves and training their staff or training their recruits to understand how they're going to handle those situations, and also acknowledge the fact that these situations are obviously going to have psychological effects on whoever, whether in this particular case, whether it be a male or a female, on them. I think I think the second important thing is also this fact that slowly and gradually, with the with our sort of life becoming more expensive every single day within the country, more and more people are looking for economic opportunities. At the end of the day, this is a government job. This is, I wouldn't say the world's best paying job, but this is an okay paying job, and there is definitely a career trajectory. So I would say that also we really can't ignore the economic benefits of any field at all, right? So perhaps also highlighting the fact that yes, this is going to be economically advantageous for your family, just because in these times, I think every single family with a single bread earner is currently struggling to survive, no matter which SEC or which strata of the society we are talking about. I would say second is that, and then the third, um, and again, that's my personal opinion, or at least what I've sort of learned from the work that I've been doing. I think it's also the fact that maybe when you're trying to sort of, as of right now, we're thinking of this as a pilot. We need to get more women in. Perhaps the best idea would be to reach out to your already present uh, male recruits, right? And ask them that now that you've been working in this service or in this force for so many years, why don't we recruit your daughters, why don't we recruit your wives, why don't we recruit your cousins, your nieces, right? I think perhaps that's one strategy, and I genuinely believe that once we sort of cross an initial threshold, automatically it becomes easier for more women to join, because then you can say, oh, these five have done it, why can't I? So perhaps finding the first five or the first 10 is the challenge here. I wish I had a straightforward answer that we do this and this will happen. Unfortunately, it's a challenge which really doesn't have a
Yeah,
yeah,
don't we
A to Z
don't we all
plan.
wish for simple answers, simple solutions to such but these are like complex things that we're talking about, right? The two things
Yeah.
that you mentioned here, one is, leaning on to the male allies, right? And
Yeah.
two is representation, right? Yes, we can aspire to, recruit more women with the help of the allies and training them, all of that. But there are some, very less women, but there are still some women in the police force, right? Do
Of
you
course.
strategize on including them in such recruitment drives? Do you know they are the faces, the women faces representing, the gender in the police force? So perhaps utilizing them in the recruitment drives to talk to younger girls and talking about their experiences, the positive ones, could help. Do you think so?
I absolutely agree. This is something that definitely does help, and that would help. Although I would definitely recommend that whenever anyone, for that matter, for any government sector or any public sector, is trying to identify a champion, what really helps is identifying a champion from within the same locality, because then that person is much more relatable. So, for example, if you were to select one woman police officer from Islamabad, then I don't know, perhaps go to Sheikhupura and be like, this person is a role model. That person is not from the locality. So, while yes, they could be a role model, they really won't be that relatable. So, spot on, you've hit the nail on the head. But I would say selecting them or choosing these ambassadors, so to speak, from the same locality or from the same region really helps. So the same community for that matter.
But like you said earlier on, it may not, it is a great solution on paper, but chances are not all localities will have representation of women, in
Yeah.
the police force. Perhaps one thing, while we're talking about the women who are already in the police force, right? One issue that I have seen in many countries when it comes to, women in the police force is the defeminization of, the women. Somehow, it kind of, it's my personal opinion and I want you to reflect on that, that almost it kinds of, reinforces the masculinity of the institution, that they feel the need to kind of fit in, so for that they have to almost defeminize themselves. Talk about that a bit.
So I would say that the problem is really deep rooted. Um, the Look at the uniforms, right? Look at the shields that the riot police is supposed to carry. Look at the entire infrastructure. So, okay, the challenges or the problem is that all of these were built for men and continue being built for men, which is why, in order to conform, women end up, as you put it, sort of, putting aside their femininity and trying to adopt more masculine attitudes or more masculine behaviors. That's because at the heart of it, even the infrastructure forces you to do that. I spoke to some women police officers recently, and one of them complained about the fact that, every single time we have a new supervisor, we go through this battle of whether I'll be allowed to wear a scarf or not. Because in her particular regiment or her particular department, they really did not have a scarf within the umbrella of the uniform. So if a supervisor comes in who's happy with her taking a scarf, he'll be like, sure, take a scarf under the cap. The other one would come in and be like, absolutely not. There is no scarf in the uniform. Take a cap and that should suffice. Now, this is one little thing. But the fact that nobody paid attention to this, because again, this is a women issue, this is not a men issue. At the heart of it, just the infrastructure, the way it sort of alienates women, I would say, is at times mind-boggling, shocking, and appalling. All of these things.
It feels like Komal will keep going in like circles
Yeah.
because now we're standing at this thing, which I completely agree with you. It's not just about the police force, but many different things, facets of our society, where we come to realize that they were designed for men, right? And now women are trying to integrate into the system. So now, before even recruitment, we have to think about the system itself. Do you find yourself and your team thinking about who to approach, how to approach, to somehow, go to the crux of the matter to redesign things?
So it's as you rightly put it, it's sort of like going in a circle, right? This change in infrastructure, this change in behavior is only going to happen when there are more women, because having more women will sort of necessitate making those changes. Now, unfortunately, because those changes are not there, women are not encouraged to join. So the idea that we have at least adopted, or what we're trying to work on, is sort of work on it from both ends, and perhaps there's a convergence point. So at the same time, educate the leadership, educate the people who are in charge of these recruitment processes, educate the people who can perhaps take affirmative action. And even if they don't agree that women perform as equally or perhaps better than men, still convincing them that, what, it doesn't, your personal opinion really doesn't have to affect the process. It's the need of the hour, and you really can't get away with not doing it, sort of driving this point home. And then at the same time, working on the other end and finding that convergence. I think that's somewhere, hopefully, we'll strike a balance. Because again, if there are not enough women, they really don't have any reason to change the infrastructure, the systems, or behavior. So yeah, we go back in circles.
We keep running in circles, yes. So in your experience of working on this issue, what are some of the biggest challenges that, you've come face to face with that have been like, oh my God, how am I going to deal with this?
So, and in this particular case, I will not name the district where we had been working, but we recently worked in one district. I would say the first key challenge was to get permission. These women had to go back, or all of these girls had to go back and get permission. In certain cases, we saw that the parents or the husband immediately gave the permission. But a few days later, that permission was revoked because apparently sort of the extended family got involved. So this goes back to the first point where I said we need to have allies amongst men for this to actually work. I would say that's the first barrier. The second barrier was sort of very interesting for us. And that was the fact that when you sort of appear for this exam, the first thing that you have to do is run a particular distance, right? 90% of the women in Pakistan don't have a space where they've ever run. So even if you ask them to run a kilometer, they wouldn't know how long a kilometer is, and they've never ever run before in a public space. So now all of a sudden you're holding this recruitment exam in a conservative district, in a conservative part of the country. You have all of the male recruits, aspirants lined up there, you have the female aspirants lined up there, and you're now asking them, sure, run a kilometer. So to sort of this was one of the surprising challenges, because this was not something we'd really sort of looked into when we were strategizing. We had to find local schools or colleges where there were grounds available, get these women to run for a day or so, just so that at the very least, they would know how long a kilometer is. And over here, I have to say that you do find male allies, and you find people who will take affirmative action. So there were officers who said that, you know what, as long as they complete a kilometer, if they did it in 10 minutes instead of 2 or 5 minutes instead of 3, it really doesn't matter. As long as they did it, it's our job to later train them. But this is a fascinating aspect that no one who's ever worked or has been born into the Pakistani society and raised here would never understand this, that where
Yeah.
are they supposed to run? Where do we take them?
Exactly.
So
Especially when you're told that, your daughter is supposed to stay within the char diwari of your house, right? Because they're the honor
exactly.
of the house, and they're just supposed to be home and cook and clean. Even if the ones were sent to school, and yes, we're generalizing, but we also know that this is we're talking about the mass majority here, right? Even
Yeah,
if they get the permission, so many times they don't even get the permission to go to their schools, right? To get education,
yeah.
because, oh my God, the daughter will have to get outside the house. But even if they get the permission to go to school, it's about walking straight down to the school, going to your class, and coming straight back, right? They're told to cover themselves in a way because all eyes are on them. So when in such a
Exactly.
situation you ask them to run, there's so many cultural, like we started off with this, that there's so many like cultural barriers there, because they might be thinking it's awkward to run when people are looking at me, right? What about my dupatta? What about my chadar?
Of
How do I
course.
run? It's just a boys thing to do, because we see boys playing in the gullies, we see boys playing in the on the roads, right? So it's not a very girly thing to do. To change that mindset, I think, is the biggest challenge here.
Absolutely. Like, it's literally every little thing, from running to the fact that you have to appear for an interview. And, you know, and again, this goes back to the education system, right? And this is exactly, you put it rightly, you have to go to the school, do rote learning, and come back. You're never really prepared for the interview. Now, you've had female teachers throughout your educational journey. You go in for the interview, and all of a sudden, in front of you is what we call a police wala. And you're going to perhaps forget half of your answers. That's going to happen to all of us, right? And that happens even when you're best prepared. Over here, we're talking. So, again, circles, I would say, Satya, is the theme of this.
Not to forget, the police doesn't really enjoy a great reputation anyway, right?
Oh,
So that is another thing. Would you like to expand on that?
I would say that definitely that has been a challenge. And I would say that's been a challenge because, again, this goes back to the fact that we have a police service or a force, which at the end of the day was set up in the colonial times. And when it was set up in the colonial times, the idea behind this police service or the force was to actually rule over the locals and sort of have the locals as subjects, right? The locals are not the equals of the police force. The police were used for tyranny over the local populations. Now, throughout this reform process, and again, I think everybody is aware of really how far we have progressed with reforms, which is not a hell lot. Um, it's the simple fact that the rules and everything is rooted into the colonial era. So we haven't been able to escape this mindset, because of which the police definitely does not enjoy a good reputation. The good thing is that we have a lot of younger officers who are actively working, who are actively trying to change this image. So I would say that as someone who works closely on the issue or the challenge, I definitely see hope. But I would say perhaps we need a catalyst to really accelerate the process. As of right now, we're looking at hope, but it's going to take some years for perhaps those younger officers to become the new leadership. So there's hope, but we definitely could use one or two catalysts.
Do you think one of the catalysts could be image building? And this is where I'm just thinking your education and your training in advertisement and, communication could come into play to just, I remember when we were kids, there was this, I don't remember the channel, but there was this channel, they would air this drama. It had Rubina Ashraf, this actor, and she
Um,
was,
it
a
was
cop.
Pasaina, I believe.
Yes, Pasiaina,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
I feel like TV is something that is there in every household, right? Well, majority of the households. So using such mediums to, build the image of police and the women representation in police to aspire, young women to come by themselves, right? Do you think on those lines?
We definitely do. I definitely do. And actually, the work that we're doing right now did start off as sort of a media campaign, and then we sort of moved from a media campaign to where. So I would say here is where the shortcoming or the challenge lied, at least at our end. We did create dramas, PSAs, we were running digital media campaigns and everything. We did see sort of a perception change in terms of, more women should join the police force, or more people thinking favorably that yes, women should join the police force. But over the years, we really did not see it translate into results. So that was again, that sort of brought us back to the drawing board, and we decided that perhaps it is time to sort of try a pilot where we try and handhold women through the recruitment cycle and perhaps see maybe we can get some of them across. Having said that, I personally think that the approach at this point in time, which perhaps would be most useful, and that's also dependent on the evolving nature of media as well. I would say that more and more of us are consuming digital media as compared to traditional media. We've already seen some women police officers within the country sort of emerge as influencers on that digital media. They're really using that platform for two purposes: aspiring other women, B also to help them become trailblazers as well. So I would say that more and more women need to be encouraged to sort of, be comfortable in pitching themselves or putting themselves as ambassadors or portraying themselves as ambassadors. So I would say that more than, at least in my opinion, more than traditional media, we could really use digital media to do that. And again, digital media, I would say, would probably be more effective because unlike a lot of the other institutions in the country, the reality is also this that the police departments really don't have extensive budgets. So, and again, as we said at the beginning, the change needs to somehow come from within the organization. Now, digital media and leveraging that and leveraging the narrative on that is something that even they have the resources to do. So I would say that yes, while docu-series and dramas can be great and not to deny their impact, I think perhaps digital media is the way forward.
That's very interesting. You said that, but it also kind of makes sense. And it kind of brings me to, if I think we agree on one thing, then that it is not just any one thing, right? And it is all
Yeah.
these different facets that we need to be working on at the same time, simultaneously, to find like a perfect balance between everything. It is changing the mindsets of women, changing the mindsets of men, trying to
Yes.
redesign the system itself, right? The recruitment drive, how can one be creative in the recruitment drive? And just overall, like the structure, right? We're talking about corruption, we're talking about training of women, both physically and mentally, and training of men using allies. And there's so many things. Komal, does it bog you down at times?
I would say that yes, there are times when it does bog. It would bog everyone down. It does bog me down as well. But then again, what usually ends up happening is that within a day or two, I'll actually end up meeting someone who will serve as an inspiration. And in that inspiration, we were doing this camp, and one of the girls who was an aspirant was getting training. Her father was a rickshaw driver, and we had actually utilized his rickshaw for placing the ad for women. So because it was placed on his rickshaw, he got to know about it, and he said that, you know what, I'm going to bring my daughter in every day for the training. It's little things like this that sort of help you move forward, because the key thing that we keep on telling ourselves is the fact that even if we're able to change one life, at the end of this,
It's
that
worth
could
it.
definitely be impact delivered. It's worth it because when one life literally means one family at the very least. So that's one thing that we're working on. And then secondly, I've had the fortune of working with some really great women police officers as well. So I would say that seeing them, and all of these are really young police officers. They're mine and yours age peers as well. So I would find them very relatable. And if they can do it, I think all of us can do it, a million other women can do it. So, yeah, these two things sort of serve
Well,
as inspiration to keep going.
well, that's a beautiful note to end this conversation on, because I do think that, you aspired, you changed, you made this shift in career, and you were aspiring to create an impact in the society. And I do think, while it's a long way to go, but I do think, of what you're talking about, there is impact that you're creating on daily basis. And that's all that one can ask for, right? One day at a time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I really hope that the next time or whenever we get the chance to talk again, we can actually, look back at this conversation and say, hey, yeah, we can now see we were able to make a difference. I would say that's the aim, hopefully.
Fingers crossed,
So
fingers
fingers
crossed.
crossed.
All the best with everything that you're doing, Komal, and thank you once again for giving me your time today.
Thank you so much, Safia, for having me.